Hello and welcome along to Sin Bin, the show where we discuss the major talking points in disciplinary matters in the sport of rugby league. Thanks for joining us. It's been a little while since we were here. 2020 it was, I think. But 2022 has produced some major talking points already in the first couple of weeks of the season. My name's Rod Studd and we're joined today by Robert Hicks, who's now the Director of Legal and Operations at the RFL. We know him as one of the top referees in the game. And Paul Cullen, the Chair of the Match Review Panel. Welcome along, chaps.
Thanks, Rob.
Let's start with Rob. Rob, first of all, I mentioned your refereeing. You've taken a step back from that. Just tell us about your situation and your new role in the game.
That's right, Rod. I retired as a full-time match official at the end of last season to take up my new role as the Director of Operations and Legal, but continue to officiate on a part-time basis, and people have seen me on games already this year. I probably refereeing more now than before, but my full-time day job now is to oversee the operational function at the RFL and the legal and to provide legal advice, and part of that role is to oversee the disciplinary and match review function.
Alongside us, Paul Cullen, as I mentioned, the Chair of the Match Review Panel. Now, I saw this week, Paul, some journalists saying that the Match Review Panel is secretive, non-transparent and anonymous. So we did think we'd film you in silhouette and use an actor's voice, but instead we've got the man himself here. Paul, good to see you.
Thanks,
Just tell us about the panel. We did this 2 years ago. We talked about how it works and who's on the panel, but refresh our memories, if you will.
Rod, it's exactly the same. It's the same four individuals, as in Phil Vevers, Nathan McAvoy, Paul Dixon and myself. And it's really consistent. We've been doing it now for at least 4 or 5 years with that same group. And we are independent. We don't work for any individual club, and we actually don't work for the RFL. We're an independent panel that are charged with reviewing Super League games, play by play, tackle by tackle from 0 to 80, and then charging any incident that's deemed to be dangerous contact or a breach of the sentencing guidelines.
I mean, I get a lot, what do you know? You've never played the game. You can hardly say you've never played the game to the gentleman you just mentioned, could you?
Well, there's over 1,600 games between us at a variety of levels across a long period of time. And in both Nathan McAvoy and Paul Dixon, they both served on the ORT, the Operational Rules Tribunal, the judge and jury on a Tuesday night. They started their work post-career on the Tuesday night and then moved into match review panel. And Phil Vevers, much travelled, 500 games under his belt, has joined us in the last few years. So it's a really consistent part of the process. It's the same four people looking at the same incidents over and over and over again.
So just tell me how this works then, because on a normal Super League weekend, or Thursday to Sunday, there will be 6 Super League matches. So how does it work when you convene on a Monday?
Well, of the 6 games, 4 members of the panel, 2 will get 2 games to review and 2 will get 1 game. That simply rotates round, and we'll review a match and take responsibility from 0 to 80, irrelevant of what happens in terms of match officials. That's a separate body headed by Steve Ganson, of course, and they have responsibility for game day, what happens between the 2 whistles. Cold light of day Monday morning, we review those incidents. So, for example, first game of the season, Catalan versus St Helens. That was actually my game, and I reviewed every single contact in that game. Probably brought in a dozen clips for Monday morning.
Busy one for you, that one.
Busy game, certainly from the first contact, the first tackle. And we then, as a panel,
yeah, important to note that you don't just sit there and go, right, him and him are all getting charged, because you review and say, I think those should be charged, but then there's a discussion in the group, isn't there? So there's a group opinion.
Yeah, in-depth 360 review of every single incident, and I am one of 4. I have a 25% shout on whether we think that incident is worthy of a charge or not, and many aren't. We simply bring them in because there's something suspicious in the tackle, there's some kind of unnatural movement in it. But we'll then decide whether that charge is an A, a B, a C, a D. We never actually suspend a player, Rod. If it's charged at grade A, B and C, there's an automatic levy with that charge. So, for example, at grade A, a player can be given a 0 or a 1 game penalty if accepted. If he accepts, the player and club plead guilty, thus practically banning themselves. If they challenge, they go up before the judge on a Tuesday night, and the judge, in his knowledge, in his wisdom, will decide whether the evidence leads to a guilty or a not guilty conviction.
Yeah, I mean, that's got nothing to do with the match review panel. I mean, if you took it in legal terms, you're the Crown Prosecution Service.
Absolutely.
And that's completely independent from the judge and jury in a court, if we're talking about proper legal proceedings.
Yes.
So that's what you're trying to aim for, isn't it?
Absolutely. 3 completely independent panels, and it's a fair shout that if you've got a 1 game, 2 game, 3 game, 4 game ban at the end of it, you ought to have deserved it because you've gone through 3 completely independent panels. And if you've been found not guilty or downgraded, as does happen, that's a very fair result as well.
Yeah.
You've had 3 independent bodies view the same incident.
Yeah. Now, what Paul started by talking about, Rob, I just want to ask you about this, is that obviously the match review panel is completely independent from the referee and touch judge and video referee if it's a TV game working on a match live in running, as it were. But I get asked quite a lot, well, how can this be right? You know, a match when the referee and the video referee said X and the match review panel have a different view. Is that a bone of contention? Or is it just human beings have different views of an incident and you're doing it on the fly, as it were, and whereas Paul has got time to sit down meticulously go through it?
I think there's 3 things to that. I think we've got games that are on television, games that aren't on television, and then we've got a match review panel that have an endless amount of time to review an incident and debate it. So if we're off telly, the referee gets one view and has to assess all the factors against all his knowledge and ultimately whether he believes there's a breach of the laws of the game, because that's his domain.
Yeah.
If he's got a video referee, that video referee may get to see some replays. We saw that at the weekend, that on the Blake Austin tackle with Michael McAlorum, he saw several replays, but he didn't see one replay that they then showed at half-time. So he's assessing that against the replays he saw. The match review panel on a Monday can spend 15 minutes on one incident deciding whether it's a charge or not.
And have a 4-person discussion as well.
And have a 4-person discussion. So we will always have slight discrepancies in what happens. But I think the key part of all this is the match review panel are there to look at the rules of the game as per the operational rules. The referees are there to assess it against the laws of the game. And whilst they are synergised, there is an element of discrepancy and nuance to what then happens. So they're not there to re-referee the game. They're there to look at whether there was misconduct that's in breach of the op rules. I think the other thing I would really like to say is, because I know we have a lot of issue about this, the match review panel charge a grade. It's A, B, C, D, E and F. That has a panel then on it, whether it might be, if it's an A, 0 or 1. The determination of how many games you get is not about the severity of the offence. That's what the grade is. You get a match ban if you have a record as per the rules. So you can have 2 players do exactly the same thing. One can get a grade A 0 matches and one can get a grade A 1 match. And the reason he gets 1 match is because he has a previous record. So when people continually say to us, how is that consistent? That's because of the record of the player, not because of the consistency of the panel.
Right. Just on that, Paul, another thing I got asked this week from fans was, because you're very transparent, contrary to belief, because every time you put a report in about every incident, don't you, and explain what had happened. But sometimes the wording is the same, but the result is different. And I think, you know, a late hit on a passer, I think people were referring to Blake Austin getting banned and Brad Dwyer for Leeds, and then Conrad Hurrell did what they believed to be very similar in Hull versus St Helens, and it had the same wording about a late hit and flexion of the neck, and yet he didn't get a ban.
Well, Conrad Hurrell was...
is that because of his previous record?
Well, no, it depends on the actual A, B or C.
Right.
But also, the language is very, very similar in terms of what constitutes that late hit and a passer. And we start always by saying, has the ball been released? So if the ball's in the hand, it's a live target for a reasonable tackle, a reasonable contact. The moment that ball leaves the fingers, so we'll always start, and that language is minuted, it's minuted language, it's not the full script of the entire conversation, which could last 30 minutes.
Right.
It's an abbreviated minutes of our conversation.
I see, yeah.
Has the ball been released? Yes, it has. Is there flexion of head, neck and spinal column? Yes, there is. And the change of compliance rod from last year to this year, previously it used to read, has there been excessive flexion of head, neck and spinal column? The word excessive has been removed.
Right.
So you hit me in the back, dink me with your shoulder, push me in the back, flip my fringe, show some movement of my head, neck and spinal column, whiplash.
Yeah, I get it, yeah.
The clock starts ticking on the charge, and does it look like a reasonable tackle? I've yet to find anyone, and I've visited practically every club. I take MRP on the road. I was in Dewsbury last night. I'll be in Rochdale tonight, in front of players and coaches, showing them the clips and showing them how we charge. So I defy anyone to say to me, if there's a ball player, someone as good as Johnny Lomax, going at the line, showing the ball and turning his body, that if you think he's got the ball, running at him, from 10 yards, pushing him in the back with 2 hands and running off is a reasonable tackle. Clearly isn't, because if you think he's got the ball, you'd tackle him, Rod. Yeah. And a tackle would be a reasonable tackle with a body, shoulder, arm contact, with a grip. Whacking someone with the shoulder and running off is never going to convince us that is a genuine tackle on a player that you think has the ball. And now we don't need excessive flexion. All we need is flexion. We can't have players being concussed that don't have the ball.
I think the other thing I would say on this is no 2 incidents are exactly the same. No. Anybody who tells you they are, it's just factually not correct, because it's not the same ground.
You know what we're going to say.
It's not the same time of the match.
You'll have seen it, Rob. You'll have seen it. You'll have read it. We all get it. All we want is consistency.
And I think reasonably we are, but ultimately you're in a spectrum. You're not in nice black and white columns of saying that's an A, that's a B. Something will be an A but close to a B. Something will be an A but close to a caution. Yeah. That's the reality of it.
Yes. I mean, the other thing you'll get is all we need is common sense. But of course you can't have common sense and consistency. It's impossible. As far as my stats show, I think there were 13 players sent off in Super League last season. Now, in the first 2 rounds this year, there's been 4. And, you know, some rudimentary maths will indicate if you carry on at that rate, there'll be over 50 in the season. Now, normally with these statistical blips, it regresses to the mean, the statistician said. It drops down and player behaviour will change. I mean, do you think that will happen, or are you just going to keep sending people off?
Well, I think there's a few things. Let's deal with what actually has changed first. Yeah. So, people keep saying that the high tackle rules have changed. The laws of the game have never changed. The Laws Committee went through a period of time looking at grading of high tackles, but that happened and the changes came in for last season. And at the start of last year, the RFL produced a guidance note explaining the difference between a careless, reckless and what would be deemed intentional high tackle. That note was shared with the clubs before the start of last season and was reshared with them this year. I would say, as a referee, any video referee that saw the replays of Dylan Napper in the last 10 years would have sent Dylan Napper off the field of play. Any video referee that saw the Bentley tackle with the replays they saw would have sent Bentley from the field of play. And any referee that saw the Luke Gale incident that is so far out the norm of the sport, accepting it could be reckless or intentional, however you want to describe it, you cannot go into a tackle studs up, feet first, because of the potential risk of injury. And that's a red card. The only other red card we've had this year was Jake Connor. Jake Connor, in the referee's opinion, was direct contact with force to the head whilst off his feet. That's a red card and would have been over the last few years. So high tackles haven't changed. Cullen's already explained how late tackles has changed, but that change actually is only relevant to the match review panel because they were looking for excess flexion previously. They're now looking for flexion. But last year, there were a number of charges for late tackles and a number of sin bins for late tackles. And then the only other change, as Cull has alluded to, relate to intentional acts of foul play that are outside the norm of the sport. So headbutting, kicking and punching.
So what you're saying is that the raft of sendings off early in the season is a statistical blip, and by the end of the season it'll be back to somewhere near the average mean number?
Absolutely. Listen,
that's probably true.
It is. We start the season on muddy pitches, in cold conditions, players starting after a couple of 12 weeks of pre-season, but probably having played 60 minutes of competitive rugby. They will make mistakes. Mistakes will be exacerbated on muddy pitches where things can go wrong. I'm not blaming players, I just say it's a reality of early season, some things happen outside the norm. Yeah. I don't expect there to be
not very many points and not very many tries, and that will change as the summer comes in.
Yes, as I'm on the road, Rod, and players and coaches are asking me this face to face. I'm in front of 30 players, and they're going, well, there's a clampdown. Look at the send-offs. And I went, every one of the send-offs you've seen, and Rob's already mentioned them, they'd have got sent off last year because there's no change in terms of high tackles or sticking your feet, leading with your feet into contact. Yeah. The things that have changed, if you now punch, where last year you could have got an A or a B or a C, it now starts at grade D. It's gone into the intentional bracket, probably where it should have been all the way, but it's now in that, and late hits on the passes. The threshold to charge has lowered because we now no longer need excessive flexion. We only need flexion. So what basically was a penalty would now be a caution. What was a caution would be a grade A. The really nasty stuff, the D's and E's, basically stay where they are, but the threshold on late hits on passes and kickers has lowered.
Yeah. So there'll be more sin bins, perhaps, Rob. Is that fair to say?
I think there were
there's been a few that I've seen pundits say, well, you know, in the current climate, to want for a better phrase, that will be a sin binning. So,
Yeah,
so is the even from the
I
on-field
like the
ref.
current climate point. I think
but that's
people,
that's the
phrase
buzz
that people
phrase,
are
isn't it?
using.
Yeah.
It is, and we would have talked about this later on. But a number of these changes went through a process and agreed by clubs and the relevant bodies that make these decisions. So we met with the clubs in 2021 on regulatory meetings. The Laws Committee that has representatives of players, coaches and clubs on it approved these changes. The coaches meeting in last season had these changes discussed at them. So some of these changes have been on the go for over 12 months. And they are actually because of the improved and increased knowledge around brain injuries and concussion. And that's what the change is because of. Because as the science and the medical knowledge gets better, the sport has a duty of care to its participants to keep it as safe as possible. And I hear fully players saying, we know the risks. I'm sure they do know the risks now because they get education from the RFL about brain health, about looking after themselves. The graduated return to play changed. We want to make the game safe.
Yeah.
And we want to make it safe so players can play it for a long period of time and that they can then go on and have long, successful retirements doing something else.
Absolutely.
And that's important that we're dealing with knowledge as of today. So when people talk about the knowledge, well, it's not like the game in the 80s. The knowledge in the 80s was significantly different to where it is now.
Just final point, because final point for now, we're going to come on to some of the specific incidents that Paul's alluded to. Let's just close on that. I mean, I watched the game in the 1980s and 1990s and I enjoyed it. You were in the middle of it.
I was. Classic poacher come gamekeeper.
Well, you were before the disciplinary once or twice, Paul, I think, from memory.
Not the best record.
But, I mean, you get this a lot, don't you? Oh, the game's gone soft. Oh, they're sanitising it. They're ruining it. They're killing the game. Was it really better in the 1980s, 1990s, Paul, or has the game grown up, if you will?
The game has matured. I honestly don't think England will ever beat Australia or New Zealand or Tonga by running behind someone and whacking them in the back and knocking them unconscious after the ball's gone. I don't know how the game improves. Some people might like to see two blokes punching each other, but this is professional rugby league. It's not boxing or mixed martial arts. So the game in the 70s and 80s and 90s was what it was. The game can't progress in 2022 by we all allow two blokes punching each other in the face for a bit of fun. We're there to play rugby league, not to punch each other. OK,
what we're going to do now is have a look at some footage of incidents which have led to bans and charges, Paul. And we're going to start with a couple of pieces of footage from live TV games. James Bentley against Leeds versus Warrington. That was in the first Channel 4 game, people remember. And then Beretta Faraimo for Castleford at Hull KR in a live Sky game. Paul, can you just talk us through these couple of clips? We know Bentley was sent off, Faraimo was sin-binned.
Yeah, James Bentley actually works from marker, so runs about 30, 40 metres at pace across field, and he has a right to do so. But if you're going to come and make a tackle on Gareth Widdop, you ought not to hit him in the head with a swinging arm. Gareth Widdop's over 6 foot tall. And although he's stepping back inside, that swinging right arm was only ever going to hit somebody in the head. It's a reckless tackle if you run that fast from that far away and launch yourself into a tackle. You better ought to tackle the body and not throw that right arm in the head. Charged at reckless, grade C, and the penalty notice attached was down to James's previous record.
Right, OK. We're going to talk to Robin in a moment or two about the fact that he appealed. We'll come on to that in a minute. What about Faraimo?
Well,
this was quite a contentious one. I got quite a lot of comments about this one, which was like, well, if that's going to be a sin-binning and a ban, well, we might as well pack up and go home. So why was it a ban?
Well, the huge incidents, when you measure this, Beretta Faraimo's run 25 metres on the back of a bomb, a high kick. And a player ought to accept that a fullback or winger catching a high kick has a right to catch and drop. It's invariably what fullbacks do. And because they catch a ball and drop to the ground to avoid that ball being taken off them or pushed in goal or pushed over the touchline, that if you drop, you can't just carry on and catch him in the head because you didn't expect him to drop. I don't know a fullback who doesn't catch a bomb and drop. They're not going to stand 6 foot tall and wait to be bent in half. So if you run 25 metres, you have to moderate your behaviour, and when you swing your arms into a tackle, not hit somebody in the head, which he obviously did. So charged at reckless because of the way he entered into the tackle, the contact with the head and the injury to the player. Reckless.
Yeah, I feel I'm almost like got you in as an expert witness, and I'm sort of interrogating you like a QC here, like Rob perhaps. But you know, on the other side of the fence, and these are the things that I set out to people I would ask you.
Yes.
Right, they say, well, how can you possibly expect a guy running at full pelt to stop in a split second? Is the answer to that run slower?
It's his responsibility. A player can go as fast and as hard as he wants to the tackle.
Right.
He ought to make the tackle. And if he mistimes it, if he misjudges it, it's his responsibility. You can't expect a fullback to catch a ball, stand still and wait to be hit. He can't. He's going to catch and drop, and you have to adjust and time your tackle.
Right. OK, so the duty of care is with the tackler. I think that we can clearly discover that. Let's look at perhaps the most famous incident of the first couple of weeks of the season, or infamous, if you prefer, when Luke Gale was sent off for an almost indescribable challenge in the match between Hull FC and St Helens. What about this one, Paul? Perhaps the most famous incident, as I say, or infamous moment of the season so far. What about it?
Absolutely, you know, it's something we hadn't seen from Luke Gale, or
from anybody for that matter.
From anybody. If you lead with your feet, that's a highly reckless or intentional act. And there's a difference in opinion there. But if you lead with your feet and your studs are up, and you put that foot towards the kicking leg of a player who has a right to kick the ball, he ought to, Johnny Lomax has a right to kick that ball without anything going into his shin, unless it's a reasonable tackle. That would be a shoulder, an arm, an upper body where you're trying to charge the ball down, or tackle the man before he kicks the ball. To lead with your studs is an intentional act.
Now, I'm not going to, in any way, manner or means, accuse Johnny Lomax of again, the vernacular milking the incident, but certainly some people were saying, well, Johnny Lomax has, gone down there like a sack of potatoes, and he's pointing at his leg and all this kind of carry on. And there is a kind of, I think, in rugby league, a kind of thing where the guy on the wrong end of the incident, if he points out to the referee, I've been clouted there, and I think you ought to do something about it, then he's worse than the aggressor, which is a strange thing to me, a completely anathema. Now, but just speaking broadly, people are saying that the RFL should, on the match review panel, should be clamping down on people milking incidents. I'm not saying for any moment that Lomax was doing that, by the way, but should that be a charge? I don't know. Simulation is the word they use in professional football, isn't it?
I think I can answer this one for Cull. I think the reality is that rugby league is a hard-fought, fast-paced collision sport. Players get injured in a variety of ways. A lot of injuries occur without foul play. A lot of injuries occur when people don't realise what they are, and they can be very, very serious. We've seen players leave the field of play on stretchers when we didn't realise there was anything at all in a tackle. And we have medics, physios and doctors who are there to treat players. They are trained professionals who understand what they are looking for. We've match officials who have protocols to stop the game in those situations. Players, like match officials, probably aren't trained in physiotherapy or medically trained. They won't know the extent of the injury. Talking specifically on the Gale one, nobody would know, because I've refereed a game where this happened, where a player kicked a ball, fell on the floor, and unfortunately broke his leg as his foot landed on the floor. Nobody knows that didn't happen. Players should leave other players on the floor and leave the authorities to deal with people if they believe they are feigning injury. But that would only be after having taken into account medical evidence that prove that. Nobody knows what happens until the assessment by the doctor. If you watch the Luke Gale incident, Luke does go to Johnny. I'm not saying why he went to Johnny. That was a matter of contention at the tribunal.
Yes.
However, you can actually see the physio trying to remonstrate calmly with Luke to say, leave him, let me look at him. He didn't even have a chance to assess him by the time that had happened. We've had a number of these charges over the last few years.
Yeah, and that was also,
player
wasn't
safety
it,
is
part
paramount.
of the charge, because there was this idea, again, that was a complete myth. Gale is getting 8 matches for the challenge with his studs. That was never the case, was it? There were 2 separate charges.
Yes, the maximum on a grade D is 3, 4 or 5. The maximum on a grade C is 3. So that's where people thought that.
And what was the second part of the second charge? Rob was just alluding to it there, this idea of manhandling an injured player.
You cannot pick an injured player up. You can't remonstrate. You can't tell him to get to his feet. Johnny Lomax could have broken his leg. You don't know whether he has or he hasn't. And in the context of that context, from the play of the ball, Johnny Lomax is 5 to 10 metres behind the play of the ball before he kicks it and runs to kick. Luke Gale's 10 metres back in the defensive line. That's 15 to 20 metres of 2 players coming together with a strong swing from Johnny Lomax's foot to kick the ball and a raised stud. that could have been disastrous. Fortunately, it wasn't, but there was a glance that damaged the shin. He has a right to go down because he's been injured. No one has a right to say any player isn't injured, and especially in terms of crusher tackles. We see this all the time. If you've landed on someone's head or neck, either carelessly, recklessly, intentionally or accidentally, you've got no idea the potential damage done. You can't go, by the way, I think you need to get up. You have no qualifications and no authority.
No, right.
If he's injured, leave him alone. Don't put your hands
That
on
was
him.
why Levi was charged. There was a crusher type tackle in that game, and Levi went and picked a player up who potentially
grabbed him.
had a neck injury.
Right.
And ultimately, we all know that the significant issue with spinal injuries.
Yeah. Now, just one final point on that, Paul. We did address this 2 years ago, but we'll just repeat it just very briefly. Does the actual damage that foul play causes affect the charge? So, if Luke Gale had broken Johnny Lomax's leg, would the charge have been higher?
Oh, yes, we would. We'd simply, you go up the scale. For example, that punch, immediately now, it's a grade D.
Yeah.
If you hit him twice and break his jaw,
Break the
you're
jaw,
getting a
the
grade
worst.
E or a grade F.
Right, OK.
It's the same in the court of law. What would be two people fighting might be a fray. You hit him with a killer punch, you're on a manslaughter charge.
Yes, I understand.
It mimics the law of the land.
Yeah, right, OK.
The more damage you do, the higher you're going to go
Talking of the
up.
law of the land, Rob, appeals. Now, there has been a culture in rugby league where, if you were found guilty and got a ban, the culture was, oh, we'll have another go. I didn't like the verdict of that disciplinary panel. I'll roll the dice again and see what the next one says, so I'll appeal. And it kind of went on like that, didn't it? And so Tuesday you get found guilty, Wednesday or Thursday you'd have an appeal and see if you could get a different number on the dice. But the rugby league now have acted to clamp down on that, if you will, this dice rolling. So just explain that to us, if you could.
Again, so the system that we now have in place, Rod, has been in place following a review by the whole game involving clubs at Super League, Championship and League One level back in 2017, which had people from the clubs and the RFL on that. They came up with a system that basically said, we want the match review panel to have the most say in what a charge is. But then there has to be a right of appeal, and you can appeal on the basis of grade or guilt. And we've seen charges already this year. We had a not guilty verdict on Paulie. We had a downgrade last night on Brearley from a B to an A. That is why you can go to the panel. But what we wanted to do was stop everybody being charged on a Monday and go to a tribunal on a Tuesday to try and basically roll the dice. So the rules were drafted to say that if you chose to take an appeal, there was 3 options that could be available to the panel. They could agree with your version and either downgrade or find not guilty. They could agree with the MRP and leave it as it was, but in cases where they believed the challenge to be unreasonable or frivolous, then they would have the opportunity to add an extra match. That basically was saying that the case you put before the tribunal was sufficiently poor enough that it deserves some form of jeopardy to that decision.
Yeah, don't waste our time.
Otherwise, we would basically may as well stop the MRP process on a Monday, charge players and put every case before a tribunal on a Tuesday. It works. It's not against natural justice. It's the same way that any appeal process works in any court of law.
Yeah,
so
I mean, I was saying to someone that you've got to have a grounds for appeal. You can't just say, I just didn't fancy that verdict, I'll have another go, if you were convicted of an offence in a court.
And I would also come back to the other narrative that's been put around there. The changing high tackle grading happened at the start of last season, not at the start of this season.
Let's just very, very quickly on that, because I read quotes from Brett Hodgson, you probably did too, say he was surprised by the way these bans were being handed out. Well, how could he be surprised? Because there was a meeting about it, wasn't there, last December, in December 2021, for coaches. Was he not there? I don't know if he was or wasn't, but he could have found out what happened at the meeting if he wasn't. Why a coach? I mean, Leeds were saying they didn't know what the procedure was before the season when Austin got banned. Are they being a little mischievous, these clubs, or do they have a point?
I think, as with everything, some things get lost in any communication, and clubs have got that many different things that they're doing in pre-season.
Perhaps the coaches have forgotten.
That perhaps they don't remember things are said, or they weren't in attendance when something first came up. So I don't think it's a case of being mischievous or deliberately doing things. Listen, the RFL tries its best to communicate with every club at every level. There is an element and an onus on clubs to accept that they have to listen to the messages that are there, but also the RFL has to reflect and say, are we getting the messages at the right level? And today, we'll continue to try and drive that message, and that's part of why we're doing this programme.
Yeah. Rob, thanks very much. So, thanks to Rob and thanks to Paul. We'll hopefully be back throughout the season discussing more talking points on disciplinary matters within rugby league. If you've got any questions or queries, please fire them along to us. But otherwise, look out for Sin Bin coming soon, again, on the RFL's social media channels. Thanks for joining us.